Okay, let's get started. Welcome again to Hot Public's live meeting. We're halfway October, and we're still going strong. And I'm really excited today to have Christopher Lucas from Washington University, assistant professor there in the lab. We've been following Chris's work for a while now. Really interesting stuff on how to analyze speeches, particularly how to model the emotional component of speeches. And we came across some recent work by him called More Than Words: How Political Rhetoric Shapes Voters' Effect and Evaluation. Did you tweet about this a while ago? Or is this entirely a secret project so far?
I think we gave it at Palmeth, and there's a paper which
yeah. So I think I had a sneak preview already, so I'm really curious. And without further ado, I want to give you the floor, Chris.
Great, thanks. It's great to be here. There's a lot of really cool work coming out of your lab that I quite like, so it's great to give a talk to you all. My name is Christopher Lucas. I'm an assistant professor at Washington University, and today I'll be presenting work that's joint with Taylor Damon, an incredibly talented graduate student at Washington University, and Dean Knox, a collaborator and friend of mine at Penn. So this morning, or I suppose afternoon for you all, I'll try to convince you that the study of political campaigns at present misses an enormously important component, namely how candidates communicate. So every study thus far, effectively, of political campaigns focuses on the text of speech. I'm going to try to attempt to, in this short talk, that by doing so, we're ignoring a tremendously important component of how voters assess candidates, namely the kind of non-textual components of human speech. Now, importantly, I'm going to suggest that this isn't an omission resulting from some, say, theoretically informed position, but rather my claim is that you and I both know that this component of speech, the way that someone talks, matters to how you kind of appraise them and make judgments about their character and all sorts of traits. But we ignore it as a field mostly because it's hard to study, because it's complicated, because of methodological limitations. So in this short presentation, I'll try to demonstrate why the sound of speech warrants academic study, and then I'll show you our approach to studying its effects. Now, again, if you find this hard to believe based on what I've just said so far, I'm going to begin with a simple illustration. So I'm going to play a brief clip of former President Barack Obama. And as you listen, pay attention to the effect of the speech and the way that the speech is delivered on your impression of the speaker.
You know what? That's not who we are. That's not what this country's about. As Americans, we believe we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights.
Now, as we're all undoubtedly aware, President Obama is an incredibly talented speaker, right? Now imagine instead that I had read precisely that same piece of text, so we've helped fix the text, and imagine how you would have responded to me reading it versus President Obama saying it in that speech. If you were to ask my undergraduates, they would quickly corroborate that I'm nowhere near as engaging as President Obama, even holding fixed the content of what I'm saying. Now, the funny thing is, this all seems sort of obvious. We all kind of appreciate that this is true. And we all expect a former president to be a better public speaker than an academic. But, and we think that matters, right, for kind of how they were selected and why they were selected and how voters appraised them. But if that's implicitly so obvious to all of us, why don't we study this? So with this example in mind, we're going to attempt to convince you more generally that this is true, that these voter perceptions are affected by these non-textual speech cues. And I'm going to try to give you some intuition about how we might go about studying these effects. So how exactly, first, does speech delivery, these non-textual components of speech, influence the way that candidates assess, or that voters assess political candidates? So in this short talk, I'm going to first begin with a brief discussion of how we might study the text on the audio speeches. This is going to build on earlier work that appeared earlier this year in the APSR. To demonstrate the face validity of some of these claims, I'm going to show you first results from a descriptive analysis relying on a novel corpus of videos from the 2012 presidential election. And I'm going to demonstrate that there is variation in the way that candidates speak in a way consistent with a sophisticated use of these sorts of non-textual components of speech. I'm then going to show you results from two experiments. In the first, we're going to demonstrate that indeed when candidates vary how they speak, that voters walk away with different impressions, and that if we compare this to just reading the text of the same speeches, we get different effects. In the second experiment, and I'm going to show you a new tool for kind of how we built and constructed the experiment using a new algorithm for approximate string matching. And then I'm going to probe the mechanisms. I'm going to try to show you where in speech these effects are coming from, with the second experiment relying on voice actors. So why might these non-textual components of speech matter? Well, political science has long been interested in outcomes that we think are likely affected by these non-textual components of speech. So for instance, in the ANES survey, a regular survey conducted for decades in the United States about politics, the survey has always included a battery of questions about candidates for the presidency. And these are questions, say, like whether or not the candidate makes you feel angry, afraid, if you find them inspiring, and so on. All of these we know from linguistics and psychology likely have some, or are likely in some part based by these sorts of subtle appraisals about, say, how candidates speak, the way they come across, these sort of non-textual components, things that exist beyond simply the platform that they take when they're on or up for election. And so you don't have to take my word for it that in fact these things are likely affected by the way candidates speak. So we're going to use these as outcomes in these experiments that we're going to conduct. So where might we expect to see in the speech of text these sorts of causes of the previous set of outcomes that I've just described? So I'm going to suggest that it's not just in the text, right? So again, imagine that we were to study the speech of that clip from President Obama using standard kind of text as data approaches. We would create a document term matrix, and suddenly that whole piece of speech would be simplified down to the following representation. Now, again, of course, it's important to note that this representation is the same that would be given if I were the candidate, right? So again, there's nothing in this document term matrix that denotes the difference between President Obama and me, even though, again, as far as our qualifications for the presidency are concerned, there could be a greater difference between the two of us, right? If it's not just in the words, of course, again, the words matter, but obviously the non-textual part I want to convince you matters as well. So if it's not just in the words, where is it? Well, so we can, for instance, plot simply the loudness of that speech over time. So now I'm showing you this curve, shows you on the x-axis time, on the y-axis loudness. And we can map the words to that same plot, and we can begin to get a picture of kind of how the speaker, in this case, President Obama, was delivering their speech and how they were using these non-textual cues. So for instance, they're emphasizing certain words, like the word not, they're pausing after key phrases. Similarly, instead of loudness, we might consider speech pitch. So this is pitch on the y-axis now, instead of volume. And again, we note interesting use of that feature, right? So we see shift up in pitch when emphasizing, say, the word Americans, around inalienable, and so on. Taken together, we get a fuller sense of how a candidate might communicate with voters. And importantly, existing approaches to the study of speech focus exclusively on the text, so just this bottom row of speech. Now, we have additional anecdotal evidence that suggests that non-textual components of speech matter. So again, like I said, I think we've all sort of mostly known this, but just to name one example, when Hillary Clinton was a candidate for the presidency, she was maligned as having a high-pitched voice. She was called shrillery in the media, right? And there are similar examples for a number of candidates. I'm not going to bore you with all of them. But again, this sort of evaluation exists broadly in kind of the way that the media and voters discuss and evaluate candidates. So how are we going to test this more directly? So to begin, I mentioned that we built this corpus of speeches. So we collected 100 different videos, stump speeches from the 2012 presidential campaign. And we're going to focus on two features in this. So just the loudness and the pitch and how they vary across a sentence and also their mean. And we paired this corpus with the Google Speech API to get also, in addition to these audio features, the text of these stump speeches, each about 45 minutes or so. And so in short, our data is going to be the following structure, right? So we have a speaker, either Romney or Obama, the date, the transcript and the location, and then also the audio features along with that. Now, let's begin with a high-level analysis of this corpus. So first, we can look at just the similarities and differences between Obama and Romney. So for instance, I can plot the loudness with its average and modulation. So you'll note that, interestingly, Romney's a slightly louder speaker than Obama, but Obama modulates his speech more. Similarly, or his loudness more. Similarly, in pitch, Obama modulates more, which is sort of consistent with this idea of him being more dynamic. Now, I'm going to show you in subsequent experiments that modulation affects certain appraisals. And I'm now going to zoom in and show you just some variation within Obama's speech in this corpus. So here, I'm going to break down Obama's speech according to issue. So we took the text of the speech, used the lexicode or policy agenda to note certain issues. And then with two-way fixed effects for speech and topic, note first that there's a clear issue-related variation in delivery. So these dot plots are showing just the mean and the variance of those loudness and pitch features. Now I'm going to highlight estimates that are significant after a multiple testing correction, and then pull a few examples. So in discussing defense and social welfare, there's relatively little variation. In contrast, on education and religion, we observe more. So let's zoom in on those. So in discussing education, Obama seems to speak at higher volumes, modulates more, and so on. We can listen to a brief example.
We shouldn't be ending college tax credits to pay for millionaires' tax cuts. We should be making college more affordable for everyone.
Whereas on religion, he speaks with a lower pitch, but more modulation.
And you and I together will remind the world why the United States of America is the greatest nation on earth. God bless you. And God bless the United States of America.
So why would he do this? Why vary speech in this way? Well, we suggest that voters are, again, using these sorts of non-textual components of speech to make appraisals about a speaker. So how do we test this? Again, I keep saying this, however, we're going to show you that it's true, that it actually affects voter appraisals. So we're going to conduct two experiments. The first uses snippets from that campaign corpus that I mentioned before. So in an ideal experiment, I'd call up, say, President Obama, maybe Biden, a few other people. I'd give them a description of the experimental protocol. We'd do some experiments, and it'd be all neat and clean. Now, you'll be shocked to learn they didn't return our calls. And so we tried to do the next best thing. So we tried to find basically naturalistic kind of paired treatments where we hold text, fix the speech of text, but find cases where the delivery varies. So to do that, we first have to find catchphrases, these commonly repeated pieces of text across this campaign trail, and then pair those catchphrases together when they vary in their delivery. So again, this is our data. So as an unconstrained problem, this text catchphrase construction is very quickly difficult for the following reason. If you imagine a given text catchphrase, say the text in red, we want to identify a plausible match, say the text in blue, but we also want to identify whether or not the next text snippet is a plausible match, and so on, throughout the entire corpus. Now, a traditional algorithm would compare each of these possible matches to the target, say the target in blue, and then increment again and look at the next target, and so on and so on and so on. This obviously gets incredibly large very quickly. And so we started with kind of normal kind of string alignment, text matching approaches, and nothing was running in remotely tractable runtimes. And so to resolve this, we proposed yet another string distance algorithm. So imagine that P and Q are word letter matrices like this, for instance. So P is going to be our needle, so our catchphrase, and Q is going to be the haystack, the kind of text corpus in which we're going to look for P. And we're going to represent them both as word by letter matrices. So again, on the x-axis here, the letter, on the Y, the word, and the color denoting the occurrence of that letter in that word. So we're going to find matches using the following measure, which you can effectively think of as basically a multidimensional measure of correlation. So again, a drawback of other similarity approaches is that often we need an exact match or we need a near match in some kind of threshold way. But we have to recalculate that individually for each matched pair. Here we're going to be able to reuse the information from one possible match for a lot of other matches as well. So we greatly reduce the number of calculations. And so the measure that we use, again, is basically kind of a high dimensional measure or multidimensional measure of correlation, where the similarity between P and Q gets computed via a Fourier transform, which is going to make things faster. And so as such, this is going to be a negative 1-to-1 measure, again, like correlation. So what does this look like in practice? So imagine, again, this haystack here, this piece of text in the campaign speech, though it's associated letter by word matrix. So in the red, I'm showing you a particular needle, a catchphrase we want to compare to this, this haystack. And so we can calculate that correlation for this first comparison. So in, say, beginning at word I, and then we increment 1. So on the far right, I'm going to show you the similarity. We increment again and calculate that measure again and again. And we can do this for the full corpus and get a measure at each offset of the similarity between the catchphrase and the corpus according to this similarity in terms. Now, that lets us identify these catchphrase pairs. And so we can find a match like the blue text here for the needle in the red, where we don't have exact matches, but we can tell that they're clearly reusing a catchphrase. We then use this to find plausible pairs from the text corpus and take 30 pairs, varying delivery, and show these to respondents in an experiment. And so respondents are shown either the text, the audio, or the video. So a pair of these catchphrases, either in text, audio, or video, where the text is mostly similar. Now, and then we look at the effects or whether or not they prefer the first or the second of this pair on those 8 outcomes that I mentioned from the ANES. Now, the result of this is as follows. Here I'm showing you just whether or not they prefer variant A or B, looking at just the text. So we have the different outcomes, and then the dot notes the proportion preferring the first of the 2 catchphrases in that pair. It's important to note that for some of these, like the offshore catchphrase pair, there is in fact a kind of general preference, it seems, for one catchphrase over the other. And that's because, again, these are approximate matches. So it turns out for this, there's a textual difference. One references a country, the other references China. And so apparently that mattered quite a bit in their appraisal. But importantly, when we show them the audio and the video, we see catchphrase pairs where there's quite a big difference. So for instance, if we look over this opportunity category, the preference for one over the other almost exactly kind of flips. So the key takeaway here again is only that when listening to and seeing the candidate, they're making different appraisals of that candidate than when simply reading the text. So where would these impressions come from? So we did a subsequent experiment to probe those mechanisms with voice actors. So we specifically conduct a factorial manipulation of speech designed as follows. So we have 4 artificial manipulations, which we conducted, which Taylor sat at the computer and manually manipulated many of these recordings, manipulating the pitch of recordings from voice actors and the volume of recordings from voice actors. So that's going to sound like this.
No act of terror.
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 No act of terror. No act of terror will dim the light of the values that we proudly shine on the rest of the world.
So we have 10 voice actors, each reading snippets of speech from that corpus that we constructed. And then in addition to the manipulations that Taylor did of, say, the volume and the pitch, we also ask the speakers to modulate their volume and pitch and also to speak faster and slower because it's more difficult to do those in an automated way. And we use 6 scripts from different tissues, which again, we take from the corpus. Now, what are the effects? So first, I'm going to show you just baseline differences across those different ANES outcomes according to the speaker. So A through J denote the different actors, and each panel denotes, again, a measure of the evaluation on those different ANES outcomes for that speaker. Now, the takeaway from this slide is that there seems to be a preference, again, holding fixed the text of speech and even the speech style for certain candidates, certain plausible hypothetical candidates, in this case, voice actors, over others. So for instance, in general, J is considerably more positively appraised than is A, based strictly on just the sound of their voice. So here again, we're holding fixed the actual policy statements the candidates are making and still seeing significant differences in preferring one candidate over the other. Here, instead of using those ANES outcomes, we have just an evaluation of willingness to vote for a candidate. And again, we see massive difference. There's sort of suggestive evidence too of a gender difference, but we don't have quite enough voice actors to really make too much of that, but would obviously be consistent with a host of findings. But the big takeaway here is now I'm going to show you the sort of effects of these different features that I mentioned. So here again on the same outcomes, measures of whether or not you find the candidate persuasive, trustworthy, and so on. You'll note that when assigned to the modulation recording, candidates are perceived to be considerably more inspiring, enthusiastic, competent, passionate, persuasive. Similarly, when they speak faster, I think actually what's happening is when they speak slower, they're appraised negatively. And we see similar results if we look at the willingness to vote for that candidate. So again, the expression of willingness to vote for a candidate when, say, they modulate and they don't speak very slowly is higher compared to the other conditions. Now, to summarize this, I've tried to show you a lot in 20 minutes, but I hope I've left you with the following. So we've tried to do the first descriptive analysis of this campaign speech style, the component of sort of how a candidate uses speech style as a tool. And then I've shown you evidence from 2 experiments that these real world differences in speaking style have effects on real world voters, and that the voice conveys information that isn't contained in your document term matrix. And finally, I've shown you some experimental evidence on speech mechanism. So how the vocal channel shapes perceptions. Again, my position is that we've sort of all known this, right? Qualitative scholars have kind of known that this matters when assessing the way that a candidate is perceived by voters. But we don't study it because, again, it's just sort of complicated, which I think is not a good reason to avoid a particular question. So I'll conclude there for Q&A, and you can find more information about my co-authors at their websites.
Thanks, Chris. Christopher or Chris? Just so.
Christopher, yeah, but
Christopher. Okay, thanks. This is a fantastic talk and some really cutting edge work. So for those of you who are new, either in the room in Amsterdam, where I am not, but also those of you who are new in the online environment, those of you in the online environment can type a question in the Q&A box, and I'd explicitly like to invite also the people who are online to ask their questions. If they ask their questions, they can type it in the Q&A box and I will read them out loud and Christopher will answer them. Christopher, I just will ask a clarification question and a question about why we not study it first before handing other people the opportunity to ask questions. So you said, well, we don't study it because it's complicated. And I definitely agree that that's one of the arguments. But is there not more reason? Are there not more reasons why we're not studying this? And let's assume that we're among like-minded people here in the room. I'm not entirely sure if I can fully judge it, but is it also not a neglect that certain fact that these things should matter among more traditional political science, political communication scholars, that it's the content that should matter? It almost seems almost like a normative component, right? It's the message that matters, and all the other things are noise that psychologists or qualitative researchers might be interested in, but we study the content of communication. So is it not? So my question for you is the technicality maybe a way of hiding for this underlying belief that that is in our disciplines?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And I think it's related. I just noticed in the online Q&A, I think Mihai asked, is this not bad for democracy that bad guys can learn good style as good or better than good guys? Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think there's something to that, right? Like this is sort of the puzzling thing when we first did that second experiment and just looked, we didn't have ex-ante hypotheses about, the variation across speakers, right? But we looked at it and suddenly we're like, well, this single male speaker is perceived to be wildly more competent than all, most of the other speakers, and the women speakers seem to be penalized in general, which again is bad, right? That's not good for democracy. At least, I think you can make that argument. The psychologists will tell you why we have these heuristics, right? And there's a series of arguments about why those developed and their utility in certain kind of low information environments. I'm not going to adopt that position as being the normatively good one. But yeah, I think there's something to that. I mean, it would be, in an ideal world, we would judge candidates based on what they do and what they say they'll do and how well they do it, right? That said, it nonetheless appears to be, if you look at the way that elections turn out, voters don't always seem to be voting in the most normatively preferable way. So I also think it just empirically seems true that in a whole number of dimensions, voters aren't voting in the way that we would in fact find morally just or good. So I think too, if we're going to study their behavior, we have to be open to them not always voting in a normatively good way.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I think this is also immediately answering or you're engaged with Mihai's question. Could you just briefly clarify before other questions? What is this modulation? I missed that a little bit. What that is? It might be a English language thing, but what is it in?
Yeah, I know that's a good question. There's only in 20 minutes. I'm trying to squeeze a lot in, so that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, the modulation. Basically, what we had in mind was, so we started this. We did this. We have another paper basically about a model for classifying text audio, and in that we modeled the audio as a hidden Markov model, where we're calculating features at small little windows, so like 12.5 milliseconds, and so the features are calculated for a sentence a number of times. And what we noticed is that if you'd reduce that information to say something just like the mean within that sentence, that a lot of information was lost. So it appeared that the variation within the sentence mattered with respect to models that would successfully classify audio. And so then we tried to then kind of come at this from the opposite direction and think, well, what's a treatment that would reflect that kind of similar information? And so here, what we basically were doing was imagining someone speaking very monotone, so not varying. I'm very bad at, I'm not very good at being an actor, it turns out. But if someone wasn't varying their loudness or pitch, right, just sort of speaking very monotone and flat, compared to letting volume and pitch go up and down, that was sort of the main one. And then we measure that. So we asked the voice actors to do that, and they're of course very good at this because they're actors, though they don't like speaking monotone. And then but then we measured it descriptively in the corpus with variation within the snippet.
Great. Okay, given that this is a hybrid lab, I'll now give the floor to Christian Piepal, who is in Amsterdam.
Hi, Christopher. Thank you a lot for the talk. That's super fascinating stuff. And I remember when I started the PhD reading some of your work, and I was super inspired by that. So that's super cool to have you here. What I wanted to ask is, did you have a look at how do these effects of these audio features, how does the size of these effects compare to different texts? That maybe picks up a little bit of what Bert asked, why we haven't studied these. Are these effects substantively large in comparison to the things we've looked at before when analyzing speeches?
Yeah, I mean, so it's difficult in this design to try to think of a text comparison. I think we could in a follow-up experiment try to design something explicitly that kind of horse racing the two. I mean, my position is not to be clear that text doesn't matter at all, right? Of course the content matters, but that the non-text part matters too. I think so. One thing we thought about, this isn't precisely what you've asked, but we've thought about, yeah, I guess a bunch of times. I mean, the short answer of it is we don't have a great kind of benchmark of the two, because it's hard to think about what the right comparison is. But we're interested in looking at that, I think, in subsequent studies for sure. I think probably what we'd find, the trick with text is you need to find a way to vary the text that isn't varying the topic, right? Like to really think of a kind of within topic variation in the tone. So it's just a tricky thing to come up with. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. Then there's a question from Ming Boyer from University of Vienna. And Ming, also via this way, congratulations on completing your PhD and starting your postdoc. So the question is this: thank you for this super interesting talk. Something that particularly stood out with the speech snippet of Obama is that he took very long pauses. Pause silence is a tool that politicians often use in speeches. Is silence included in average modulation of loudness in your research, or is silence another property entirely?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think those sorts of observations are exactly what motivated a lot of this, where we basically were in our kind of text or our audio kind of supervised audio classification paper, we're noting that those sorts of kind of long pauses really get kind of masked by just taking the mean. I mean, obviously it'll move a little bit, but not nearly as much as kind of the kind of long pauses suggest. So if there are many of these frequent pauses, it does show up more in the kind of modulation, which is basically just, again, the variance of this. So those long pauses obviously are creating a second mode in that distribution of the loudness or pitch over the sentence, taking a small snippets of time. So that bimodal distribution has greater variance. We though could also include just a measure of like loudness in the proportion silent or something, right? Or which is an interesting additional way to think about this, which we even do in reverse for some of the descriptive stuff and look at some of those differences. So that's an interesting observation that we should add to the paper.
Great, thanks. And we'll go to the next question from Hank. Is it an option to technically reduce or increase modulation and pitch instead of using voice actors? I see movies with voice concealers and Star Trek. There it seems simple.
Yeah, so you can definitely do it. What we're trying to avoid was manipulation, excuse me, that sounded false or sort of that didn't sound believable. And so when we were trying to manipulate, especially, so rate of speech, right, was one of the things we manipulated, and that's incredibly difficult to manipulate manually without also changing the way that the pitch sounds. So yeah, it definitely could be done. At the end of the day, it wasn't, we had voice actors read basically 20 10-second scripts, so it was not that expensive relative to the cost of the experiment to get actors to do it. So you could do it, but it'd be harder, I think, than just getting actors to do it.
Did you tell voice actor A that she wasn't liked, or J that she was?
We didn't know. That's partly why I don't think they know which is which. So
okay. Another question from Diamantis Petropoulos Petalas, a postdoc in the Hall Politics Lab. This fantastic line of work, very inspiring and structured. Thank you, Christopher. My question is about the fundamental mechanism that is behind this effect of pitch modulation. Do you think it rests on pitch perception that seems to be fine-tuned during early infancy? Or do you also think that other linguistic elements are interesting to look at? For instance, rhythm or even prosody, combination of pitch and rhythm in speech?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did Dean and I are on this mini author paper at Science, in which we were looking at basically the universality of music, right? So these underlying kind of like ways that we interact with music, some deep kind of psychological thing, or are they, entirely learned kind of cultural components? And so we've actually done, it's interesting you asked that, because we've done a little bit of work kind of on in this line. I think probably, I'm not certain so much. I do think probably these are sort of the function of these sort of psychological heuristics, the degree to which that's related to the way that we perceive music versus, the way that we've learned to evaluate each other, I'm not certain. But it's an interesting thing to think more about. I'll have to think more about that to kind of really decide where I come down on. But it probably is in some way related, I would have to guess.
Great, thanks. Then we'll switch to Amsterdam, where Maaike Homan has a question. Guys, you have to turn on the sound.
Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, great. Yeah, thank you for a super interesting talk. I have a question about the role of facial expressions. In the first experiment, I think you showed audio, but also video. And I think I maybe missed the comparison between the two. And just I was wondering how much facial expression matter, and especially in combination with the audio.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we tried when we started this whole, Dina and I started this line of work when we were roommates in grad school. And we started in the living room of our apartment in Cambridge, Massachusetts, actually with a computer vision kind of approach to the paper. So we started finding facial landmarks and thinking about effects and trying to classify those things. There were a bunch of reasons that we focused on the audio. The primary one was, well, I guess there are two reasons. So there are two primary reasons. One is that in the data that we have, it's very difficult to actually measure these facial expressions well at the extent that they actually probably matter. So the corpus that we constructed is just mostly from videos on YouTube, which are sufficiently coarsened, and that is to say of low quality, that when you try to find movement in the eyelid or something, or nostrils flaring, that's just measured with so much error that the effect is incredibly difficult to really capture. Given that, so I think it probably has lots of effects. Given that error, there's actually not that much information in that signal because the noise is just too strong. But I do think that it matters a lot. The other thing is of course, there are also these papers about just general, the way someone looks and how they're praised, kind of facial competence type papers, which political scientists have studied. So there's both the within-person, within-person variation and the across-person variation, both of which probably matter. We haven't, I think to really study that, again, you'd probably need an experiment with actors, again, because of the data quality issue, or you need to find a corpus of candidates that had a video signal that was more, that was of higher quality than the one that we had.
Great, thanks. Is there another question in the room in Amsterdam?
Yeah, I had a question, but maybe someone else too. Yeah, I have multiple questions. I have to decide. Yes, I know. What I find really interesting, that we had a psychologist here in the lab a few, pre-pandemic, a long time ago, Disa Sauter. She's an expert on the relationship between voice and emotion expression. And so in her work and that of other psychologists, there are at least 18 different acoustic parameters that are being used. I very much like that. In addition to pitch, I see you using loudness, but there are many more acoustic parameters that are used in this psychology of emotions field. Why have you chosen to focus on pitch and loudness?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we've used in our kind of supervised classification stuff, we use, all sorts of features. So basically effectively those features probably that this person talked about, and then all their kind of interactions and derivatives and stuff. So, and of course, so in that kind of line of work, we've observed that those things matter a lot for classification. We focus on these two features for two reasons. The first is that it was easier to get actors, basically it was easier to do the manipulations. So it's very difficult to, in a naturalistic way, manipulate the fourth Mel-Sepstrom coefficient or something, right? It's just I don't know, if you do it, it sounds very strange. And so actor manipulation part was difficult to pair with it. I do think that's a really interesting question though, because it would be trivially easy to pair that with just in the descriptive analysis, we could just look at kind of variation across those other dimensions. But the short answer is basically we focus on this for the combination of it's easier to do in the voice actor experiment and just simplicity for presenting in the paper. Yeah.
Great. Let's go back to a couple of online questions again. The next question is from Tom Hackenberg, who is an intern in our lab at the moment. He also thanks you for the talk and wonders if in the last slide you mentioned that the pace of speech seems to matter. Do you have an explanation for this?
I think, yeah, I think basically what's happening is that the slow speech is being penalized more than the faster speech is being benefited. And I think that's just, that condition was more, I think, normal pace versus slow than normal pace versus fast. So the baseline, I think, is sort of plotting kind of droll speech, which I think voters find annoying.
Okay. I was interested, as somebody who's known to speak too fast, I was hoping that. Okay, so another question from Diamantis. In addition, as you said, we have long assumed, and we now see some interesting effects of voice pitch modulation. We've also long assumed that musical background stimuli can have an effect on outcomes like preferences, appraisals, etc. Based on your work, which aspects of the musical stimulus would you think are interesting to look at?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so effects of music exposure on political preferences. I don't know. I mean, I think that's a line of research I would love to take up, though. I in my former life played in a band, so that would be quite fun. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think probably these things are so hard to disentangle causally, right? Because there's also so much just of preference for certain things that are, of course, a function of something underlying, and so they get kind of confounded when we look at their correlation in the population. I mean, it would be interesting to look at firstly, though, just like effects of I don't know, does Bob Dylan make you more progressive? Like that seems interesting and plausible, maybe, I don't know. But also probably in a more serious academic sense, I do think, there are all these papers about music and creativity and how that affects these sorts of things. And that's probably where I'd at least start, I guess, if that is a correct interpretation of your question.
Great, thanks. There's a question from Dirk de Kleer. Thanks for presenting this fascinating work. My question, if I remember well from your presentation, you find direct effects for fast and slow speech. Did you also consider or find effects of the length of the speeches? In other words, do speech variations matter more in sound bites than they do in long-winded speeches?
That's a good question. So in our experiment, everything was basically a short clip. I do think basically that it becomes incredibly difficult to think about effects of these sorts of things across longer and longer and longer snippets of speech, because there's more and more and more stuff that's varying, right? One thing that you could do, that we thought about doing, is something like, imagine showing a subject a 60-minute video, and then I would love to just put some sort of like heart rate monitor or something on them, or some sort of skin conductance thing, and look at just how basically to get a continuous measure of some emotional outcome across the full length of, say, a 60-minute speech. We've also thought about doing something like have them kind of give real-time responses to questions, like maybe every 20 seconds, ask them to click a button about whether or not they're more excited about the candidate, less, or staying the same, or something like this, and kind of get a measure of how that's changing over the full course of that component. We also thought about this in debates. It's easier to think about this because you do get some of these real-time responses like audience applause and stuff. So I don't think, we could actually try to get more out of our out of the kind of descriptive analysis of the corpus on that, I think, actually, with something like applause or interjections. But I think the best study would be kind of one of these sort of skin conducting lab type studies, which I'd love to do.
Okay. Matthijs Roodduin, who's also one of the co-founders of our lab. Thanks, Christopher. Very interesting research. 2 questions and a comment. Matthijs took the time to write. Let's take them question by question. What can you tell us about the extent to which politicians play with rate, pitch, modulation, etc.? Do candidates just differ from each other, or do they also change this consciously? And has this been studied or asked? So let's do this first question first.
Great, yeah. That's interesting. So this was one of the more kind of profound observations we had when beginning the study. So we called up in the United States, at least, there are a bunch of different nonprofits that exist to train kind of new entrants into politics to be effective candidates for office. So for instance, recruiting, say, more women to run for office. And these organizations all provide direct like speech training. So they have actual voice coaches come in who evaluate their speech ability, help train them to give effective stump speeches. Then if we also called up, people who worked for campaigns and campaign managers, all of whom said that this was a thing that each candidate sort of particularly worked at. They regularly practiced this, they focus grouped certain delivery styles and tried to improve and worked with voice coaches. So I think absolutely there seems to be a tremendous amount of attention and focus on this from candidates. There probably also is, of course, some cross-person variation. I don't think any amount of kind of voice training would ever make me as effective an orator as Barack Obama. So I think it probably is a little bit of both, but certainly there is some attempt to be better.
Yeah, so just a thought. You should be able, if you would track people over time, you should be able to see some development, right? If I don't know if it's, or some differences between levels of professionalization of the level which they're a politician. I guess in a country like the US with so many elected officials, you might see some of maybe people from the school board also practice their voice pitch. Who knows? Okay, a second question from Matthijs. Could you tell us more about the differences between the issues? Which types of non-text factors matter for which types of issues?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think unsurprisingly, where you get the most of this kind of like really theatrical delivery type stuff is the sort of issue areas that we associate as sort of more emotive. So it's not, statements about the budget deficit, right? It's statements about religion or about poverty, often from Democrats and stuff. So I think in general, probably what you would find if you looked at that more extensively is something like that. Like the issues that have some sort of emotional valence are ones where these sorts of rhetorical strategies are more effective, whereas lower kind of emotional valenced issues probably have no or even maybe a negative effect.
Great. A comment from Mihai is that I think it's in response to the discussion on the sort of the audience synchrony idea with skin conductance, that you could also put people in the brain scanner and let them listen to speeches. I think that's indeed a possibility. Then a question from Melissa Baker, University of Toronto. Thanks for your great talk, Christopher. Do you have a sense of whether high-profile politicians' speech on any of the dimensions is vastly different from how normal people talk about politics? I wonder if appraisal is partially influenced by whether speech is similar to what a person is used to hearing in their typical lives.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that relates to, one thing we thought about was sort of the kind of speech home style. And there are all these, again, kind of anecdotal reports of, you got this a lot with, again, Barack Obama, when, he would speak one way when speaking to a kind of national audience, and another way when speaking to the different kind of local audiences in Chicago or something. You get this a lot with in particular, I think accents, right, and sort of local sort of vocabularies, people will try to bring them out when they want to seem like the people that they're talking to, and maybe we'll try to make them more muted when they're speaking to a broader audience. I would bet that that's kind of around the way that variation would go, that you'd see that sort of, if there was a within group kind of rhetorical style or something that was common, probably doing that would be positively, or would elicit a positive response. Doing that to a broader set of people that include out-group members who don't speak in that way, I would imagine it might either get washed out or go the other direction.
Great. I'm looking also in the room in Amsterdam if there's still a question. Yes, Christian has a question.
I have another question. I think we can already know that there's a limit to the positive effective pitch. At some point, it just becomes weird. But do you have any idea on how that might also play out for modulation? Like if there's too much modulation in pitch, and how that might play out? But also for the first one, like when it comes to this upper limit of pitch, is what the idea is, if there's like a universal one, or how it differs between different people. For instance, he gave the example of Hillary Clinton, right? And also the story of Margaret Thatcher, who lowered the pitch in her voice famously, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. You're right in that, of course, these aren't linear effects, right? At some point, you know, they probably become strange, and then at another point they become, in the limit, they're not, you know, we can't hear them, at least with pitch. So yeah, I think probably, I mean, I bet it would be the case that, I mean, certainly being within the normal range of human speech is probably, you know, where that limit lies. I do think probably that there's some person-to-person variation though. So evidence in favor of this is, I didn't highlight this. It's a shame. In hindsight, I wish we were constrained by budget. So we didn't want to hire 100 voice actors. We hired the number that we hired because that, you know, 10 is not that expensive, but 1,000 is. But we did, but I wish we could have hired more, because we could make more, we could say more about this person-to-person question that you're asking. Along that lines in the data that we have, it does appear that, for instance, again, women are penalized more if they don't use these sorts of kind of speech features than men are. So that basically women, if they don't come across as kind of very good speakers, are perceived, the penalty is basically higher, is where a lot of that variation is coming from on the gender differences, which is consistent with this idea of there being variation in the effect, heterogeneous effects of those kind of features across people. And I would bet that there's also within gender differences too.
So, but do you think it is how it might work with modulation?
You mean in the limit, basically?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think, I mean, there's certainly got to be, you know, again, you can certainly, I bet, modulate too much. I think when you ask voice actors to modulate, you know, they're trying to, like, they really didn't like being asked to do this. Like, we asked them to do something that they knew would not be kind of their best delivery of this line, and they hated it. They wanted to obviously come in and deliver the line in the, you know, the most kind of impassioned way possible, and they didn't like being asked to do something slightly strange. You know, I think, yeah, if you ask them to modulate in a sort of almost caricatured way, I think there'd also be a kind of negative effect of that being just sort of, again, penalized. So we could do a follow-up with, like, you know, more, instead of making these binary, do like low, medium, high or something. Binary is also easier because with modulation, we basically ask them, now modulate more or less, right? Whereas modulate a 1 out of 10 or a 2 out of 10 was trickier.
Yes, there's a last question from the online environment from Omer Farouk Metin. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Hello, I'm from Sciences Po Paris. My question is whether you implemented real-world experiment before the election or, my question is whether you implemented real-world experiment before the election or about real-world candidates. Do you have any concerns that citizens would react differently when they already know politicians' persona, voice, irritation? So
yeah, that was a key concern we had in the design. So in the first so we conducted this well after, I mean, it was like 2016 when we put the corpus together. We started writing a totally different paper and then have come back to this one. And so that's sort of the way that this paper evolved. Yes, so we did it after the election. In the first experiment, they're only doing within candidate comparisons. The first experiment has kind of hard, like the experiments and the results in the first experiment are somewhat difficult to really summarize quickly because they're also just not that big. And I think a lot of that is exactly this reason that basically like everyone knows how they feel about Romney and Obama, and they can recognize Romney and Obama when they speak. And so, you know, that's just swamping all of this because they've heard so much of Romney and Obama that their impressions are so fortified. But because it's a within candidate kind of treatment, that's not driving the differences that we do observe. In the second experiment, it's just the voice actors. And so there's no way that they would recognize those actors. And that's partly why we did the voice actor experiment, to kind of try to guard ourselves against that sort of concern.
Thanks a lot,
Okay.
Bert.
No, I wanted to hand the floor over to you if you were there. So Gijs, you go ahead.
Thank you. What a privilege. Thanks a lot, Christopher. It's really exciting stuff, and I'm really looking forward to seeing this in pre-print, print, and post-print, real print, digital print, and of course, as all the speakers in the Hot Politics Lab, you will get the infamous Hot Politics Lab coffee mug. And I'm hoping that this year I'll be able to go to Chicago to the NPSA, and I will bring a suitcase with me, an extra one just for the mugs, because I'm 2 years behind in delivering, and maybe we can meet there. I will end this meeting with announcing a couple of announcements for next week, for next weeks. We'll have a number of exciting talks coming up. Next week, October 22, same time, same place. No, not exactly the same place, because we'll be meeting again in the common room, but it will be the same link for those of you who want to join us online. We have Graduate Friday. So we have a talk by Leonard Schuurman from the University of Cologne, currently visiting us. He's in the room, his very small figure there in the back. Do you need to be violent to be heard? Responsiveness and emotional reaction of Western European parties to political protests. And we'll also have a talk by Isabella Rebasso, and I assume that's going to be about political sophistication. And well, maybe you can announce it. Ed?
Political sophistication and emotions. Political
Sophistication and Emotions. A follow-up project from some work Isabella has already presented. And then the week after that, the 29th of October, we had a talk by Alan Senfi, who was last week announced as an actual neuroscientist, and he is an actual neuroscientist indeed, one of the world experts on this field. His title still says to be announced, but I assume he will talk about political neuroscience. Then November 5, we go from neuroscience to sociology. We'll have Giselinde Kuipers, a world expert on humor, and she will give a talk on humor and polarization, how humor can drive people apart in politics and beyond. After that, we'll have a whole range of meetings. Hannah Naam, Jamie Settle, next. And again, Graduate Friday with Christian Piepal and Matthijs Gillissen. After that, Leonie Halli, Frederick Happ, and then it's Christmas. So lots of exciting stuff coming up, and I'm really hoping to see all of you there. And thanks for attending, and have a good weekend.